with regard to this group which has gathered here, and of course we can have many more people joining us in some kind of continuing discussions on the topics that we have discussed, or maybe some new themes that we can take up, whether it can take a shape of a network perhaps. So these ideas we would like to first have, and then maybe we could consider and see whether we can, this is not just a one-off event, but we could continue with our discussions on some very interesting themes that have been raised. And I'm sure since the situation is dynamic, we will also have some new issues to discuss. So how do we do that? That would also be, we would welcome suggestions on this. So then we have also added a half an hour discussion to this session, which we'll do after the chairs have presented their views on Ukraine and its impact on the great power relations, and perhaps also on the nuclear order. There I would request, Mr. Klopkov has made some brief remarks in the morning, but as he joins us, I'll request him to add to those remarks, and I will also request Professor Ramesh Thakur to make a brief presentation, and then we can have some discussion on this very important issue. Can you join us, Anton? We would have a discussion. I was saying that after the chairs have made their remarks, we would have a half an hour discussion on Ukraine. And you have already made some remarks, but if you wish to add to those, then we can have a discussion on this very important issue and what impact it will have on the emerging nuclear order. So may I now request, session-wise, we will go, and may I now request Dr. Sverre Lodgaard to kindly make his presentation.
Thank you, Chairman. To do what you requested us to do in 5 to 7 minutes is a very tall order. But I'll that's also true. But I'll try to accommodate as best I can. First, to be very brief, Bruno's account yesterday morning of the state and evolution of nuclear postures, I found that to be comprehensive and quite accurate. So I think he and the organizers would do us a great service if you were to distribute the text on which that intervention was based. That's one point, quickly. Secondly, in the first session of yesterday, we began to discuss the moral and the security imperatives, and how to reconcile the two and how to combine the two for the benefit of nuclear disarmament. And that led on to, in my view, the most interesting discussion theme at this conference, the humanitarian approach and the approaches that take security issues as their point of departure. The nuclear war history can be read and understood as a struggle between the futility and the utility of nuclear weapons. And from a somewhat different take on the same issues, Ambassador Sharma yesterday expanded on this theme by showing how the balance of moral and security imperatives have been shifting over time. The humanitarian approach has been tried before, but listening to Rebecca on my panel, the advocacy this time is more comprehensive, and there are many more governmental and civil society stakeholders buying into that approach, so that the weight behind some of the logical conclusions, no use, a ban, is much stronger this time. So what then about no first use? Well, that proposition emanates from the security discourse. It was pointed out, I think, by Patricia, that no first use gives credence to the mentality that we still have to prepare for nuclear war, and that it in this way preserves nuclear deterrence postures. I think that is true. However, we can't expect the nuclear weapon states to leapfrog to erase the platform on which they are standing. And I was a bit surprised yesterday that the logical disarmament corollary of no first use was not spelt out. This is a doctrine which says nuclear weapons have one role and one only, to deter their use by others. And it follows logically that if nobody had them, nobody would need them. I think there is an important, interesting interface between these two approaches, and this is bringing me to extended deterrence. And again, Patricia touched on it before the break. No first use, of course, would do away with extended deterrence, and the humanitarian approach taps into extended deterrence in the sense that some countries under the nuclear umbrella have been joining the humanitarian initiatives, and others might follow suit. The long and short of this, in my view, is that we should by no means avoid setting the one up against the other. It is my experience that whenever you have to try to come to grips with a complex, difficult problem, one single approach does not do the trick. We have to try to get at it, get at the problems from many angles, from many approaches, and maybe the most important single topic to follow up on after this interesting discussions that we have had would be exactly to try to sort out the relationship between these approaches and how best to combine them, as I said, in a way that can bring disarmament forward. Maybe, Mr. Chairman, I can make one more comment, just one more comment. Nuclear deterrence, we have spent a lot of time on that, is a special mode of communication. And there are also special modes of communication to uphold deterrence policies. I saw during the Cold War many times over how nuclear weapon establishments or nuclear weapon bureaucrats on the two sides of the Atlantic were colluding to expand their turf. For instance, European bureaucrats would indicate to their American counterparts that we have serious concerns about our security, we need to deploy new weapons. And then the American opposite numbers were well prepared to take that message on board, and then the bureaucrats became the Europeans. The Europeans are requesting this and that in terms of new weapons deployments. In 2009, I watched the congressional review report on nuclear weapons, and that report said that the Japanese want the United States to keep the nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, the TLAM-N. And the government of Japan at the time wrote a letter to Hillary Clinton saying that they had not requested this, and they had been consulting the previous administration, and such a message had not come from the previous administration either. Quite obviously, it had come from prominent members of the Japanese security establishment, and they became the Japanese. This, Mr. Chairman, is a practice that we ought to make transparent to the best of our ability. I would like to come back to the Ukrainian issue, but I keep that for later.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lodgaard, for very nicely summing up the first session. And the one important point that you have made is that it's a combination of approaches, it's the security and the moral approaches that would need to be worked out, and a right balance which will achieve progress in terms of achieving nuclear disarmament. So now I request the chair of session 2, that is Dr. Sidhu, to make his comments, please.
Thank you. The second session focused on nuclear risks and threats, and the concept paper laid out a set of excellent questions, and I'll just sort of note them here. This was what the panel was supposed to address, talking about the Nuclear Security Summit. Are these groupings of like-minded countries the only way to go forward? Is not a more comprehensive global approach desirable? And if so, how can it be achieved? What does nuclear terrorism imply for deterrence? Well, the group sort of answered some of these questions, but more importantly, they raised some more. And in fact, I could argue that perhaps there was a proliferation of a lot of more points, by the panelists on this particular issue of nuclear risks and threats. But if I was to try and sum up the gist of the panel or the session in one word conclusion, I'd probably have to say that the situation is dynamic or evolving, a word that you used as well, Mr. Chair, and it's evolving faster than the responses to it are evolving. And there you can see this growing gap between, what the situation is and where it's moving to and how we're sort of responding to it. And some of this goes back to the first panel, the divide and how different actors are approaching this issue. And of course, like the other panels, this one was divided into two themes. The first one focused on addressing today's risks of proliferation. And here really, I think the central point that came out was the notion that the deterrence discourse itself is a main proliferation driver. So this then raises the fundamental question, which I think the panel began to sort of address but didn't sort of go in great detail, was how do you actually start to go about changing this discourse? How do you try to replace this discourse? One of the other issues that came up was, even as you are trying to address that, what are the interim measures that you need to take? What are the interim arrangements that are necessary, especially between states? And a related issue is, how should this discourse evolve? Should it be done multilaterally, which would be quite radical because that really hasn't happened? Should it be done plurilaterally? Should it be done in some other fora? And what should be the criteria? How would you sort of judge that? The second theme of the panel focused on tackling the challenges of nuclear terrorism. And here I'm going to highlight three sort of interesting developments which were shared, which have implications for the way we look at these issues going forward. The first was, I think, in terms of violent extremist organizations, as the term was coined, or nuclear terrorists. Nuclear use of nuclear weapons by terrorists remains a low probability but a high risk. I think that's an important continuation that we've sort of heard. But there were, I think, two or three new elements which I think are worth underlining and highlighting. First of them is this concern of nuclear terrorism by state actors, and particularly the case of North Korea was given as an instance of a state which might actually develop not nuclear weapons per se, but radiological devices, dirty bombs. They were described as a poor man's nuclear weapon. Related to that, in another regional dimension, was also the notion of deception and spoofing in South Asia, and again, how that sort of played out. Two other elements, I think, which are critical. One, slightly familiar now, particularly on the subcontinent, is conventional attacks by extremist organizations, violent extremist organizations, and the instance of Mumbai was given in that context, but also Marriott, and how that might sort of play out. Another new element in terms of non-state actors, which unfortunately we didn't get a chance to discuss as much, was the role of cyber tools. and in particular to sea-launched command control as well as offensive cyber attacks, and how this is a new complication in an already tricky scenario. The second sort of set of issues that came up in this particular session was the three concluded nuclear security summits. And I think there was a very eloquent summing up of the strengths and weaknesses of this process. Clearly the biggest strength was that it had built norms, and it was also focusing towards a degree of prevention and awareness rather than a reactive response later on. But there are also significant weaknesses, and two of them in particular are the neglect of military stocks in particular, but second, that it's also not universal. Many of the countries, which are, shall we say, countries of concern, remain outside this process. And so one of the challenges is how do you sort of bring them, into this process. The third sort of issue that came up was, and partly tangentially through the Nuclear Security Summit, but in other contexts as well, how does one actually objectively assess nuclear security of material, but perhaps also weapons? How do you verify it? And this, of course, came up in the context of the NTI report, but I think, its ramifications are critical, broadly looking. And, we had an interesting discussion on the distinction between transparency versus confidentiality. And here, I think it may be interesting to look at either the Chemical Weapons Convention to see how it addressed that particular issue, or indeed even the India-Pakistan non-attack on nuclear facilities arrangement, and how that addresses that issue, and whether that's something which one can explore. So let me then end by suggesting three sets of recommendations, and I think these are really more by way of follow-on projects, and I'm putting on really my researcher's turban here to say, look, if I was going to take this forward, what are the 3 or 4 areas that I'd really be interested in? And I think the first of them is really, how do you change the nuclear deterrence discourse, right? And second, and some of this you heard in the last panel, right? What should the new discourse be to manage relations between the major powers? And here again, the cut is, of course, you've got existing major powers, but you've also got emerging major powers, right? Second, related to that is, at what institutions should this discourse be developed? Again, should it be in existing institutions, or do you need to establish new institutions? Related to that, what would be the venue of this? Again, would it be existing institutions, or do you need to think about new institutions? And last but not the least, weapons. Are we only going to talk about existing weapons, which in this case are nuclear weapons, or do you also look at new weapons, emerging technologies, and how that might sort of play out as well, right? And perhaps a fourth one may be processes. How do you sort of go forward? But I think that's sort of involved a little bit in the institutional part. The second is kind of separate project maybe, how does one institutionalize, deepen, and universalize the Nuclear Security Summit? And how can the process be made more comprehensive as well as global? But here I'm really sort of looking at the role of emerging powers and countries like India. Why is it, for example, that none of the countries in the global south, not just the physical south, host one of these summits? Why have some of these countries, which frankly stand to gain the most by some of the efforts of the Nuclear Security Summit, not taken a greater role in this going forward? What is the kind of challenge there? And the third, it relates again, I think, to the question that I raised about, can you actually have an objective system of, if you like, ensuring security? And again, perhaps triggered by the NTI index, one of the questions I think worth asking is, what should be the objective criteria which can be verified of measuring nuclear material security? And here I really threw out a challenge, and I'll stop with that, Mr. Chair, is can Indian think tanks actually develop a criteria instead of just reacting to existing reports coming out from other think tanks in other parts of the world? And what might that entail? Thank you.
Thank you. So you ended with a bouncer, and I think that can be hit for a 6. It's not that difficult.
I hope so.
But you raised this very important issue of the implication of nuclear terrorism for deterrence, and that the question was raised, but whether the answer is there or no, that is, I think, that itself will define perhaps the research agenda. And then, of course, you have listed a number of topics for further research, and some research is being done, but I think they should be taken on board by researchers. But this issue of cyber threats, now I think this has been there in the nuclear security summit declarations. This is when you read the literature on cyber security, it is so scary because of the very specific nature of cyber threat, the cyberspace. The nuclear seems quite easier because you can talk about verifications and you can talk about safeguards and to talk about institutions. But in the cyber world, there is nothing of the sort. And the combination is absolutely deadly. And I think what it will do to deterrence, that is itself, I think, merits conference and some discussion. So thank you very much. And now I move to the session 3 chair, Dr. Teresa Hitchens, who was chairing a session on challenges of a nuclear weapon-free world.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to say I'm a bit hesitant to try to sufficiently wrap up yesterday's session, which was fairly complex in the ideas put forward about the challenges and the potential responses to creating stability on the way to zero and in a nuclear-free world, including the challenges of verification. So rather than try to attempt to recap in detail, I'm simply going to give a few thoughts, some musings on what happened and what was said, what's important. On the issue of stability, the first question it seems to me that we have to answer is, do we really all believe that a nuclear weapons-free world is a good idea? That it will create a more peaceful world. And it is clear to me that there are differing perceptions amongst the nuclear possessor states, and of course between the nuclear states and the non-nuclear states. Indeed, as we heard Ambassador Kausikan yesterday at the session, who argued that none of the nuclear weapon states actually want to divest, and that a nuclear-free world is simply a dream, and that it might be even less stable. As a former journalist, I usually admire a healthy dose of skepticism or even cynicism, and we do need to understand that there are different perceptions. What you see depends on where you sit. However, I would like to point out that at least 5 of the nuclear weapon states are actually legally bound under the NPT to nuclear disarmament. And while one can argue about the exact nature or time frame of that commitment, it is nonetheless a legal commitment that no state party to the treaty can or should take lightly. Several other nuclear possessing states, like India, have declaratory policy that continues to stress the goal of a nuclear-free world. And if we want a stable and peaceful world, it seems to me that we need to continue to stress the importance of international law and the political duty for nation states to put their money where their mouths are. And increasingly, as we heard in the very last panel of today, nation states are being held accountable by civil society in an increasingly globalized world, a trend which will continue and which fundamentally is beginning to challenge the very concept of state power and sovereignty. And that seems to me to be something that we ought to be taking some time to look at in future discussions. I will also note that, as Patricia Lewis put forward, most nuclear weapons holders are now actually in a position where their arsenals neither can be seen by policymakers and militaries alike to actually deter aggression, nor to be effective in warfighting. Thus, the utility of nuclear arsenals is in question, which could eventually change perceptions of their value in strategic doctrines. It is an old saga amongst the so-called realists in the security community that weapons bans are only achievable when states agree that the weapons are not really usable or desirable. In other words, when no one wants one. I do think this has a small grain of truth to it. So it seems to me that the ongoing discussions about the utility of nuclear weapons in many states is a sign that a nuclear-free world is actually attainable. One of the roles of the proponents of global zero then must be to try to set the conditions where nuclear weapons are no longer wanted. And this seems to me to be one of the key values of the renewed interest in the devastating humanitarian effects of nuclear weapons usage. At the same time, we heard from Dr. Sethi that there are currently different ideas about how to reach zero. We know that. These range from the simple countdown in numbers until we get to zero to weaponless deterrence, whereby states retain the capability to reconstruct their arsenal as a deterrent, to an assurance-based regime, which she championed, in which all states commit to a no first-use posture and no threat of use. And finally, a ban on the use or threat of use. And while many question the no first-use posture as declaratory and non-verifiable, there is an argument to be made that setting a strong norm against use and threat of use of nuclear weapons could help to create the conditions, again, for actually getting to zero and to lowering the utility of the weapons, and that such a posture could be partially verified. Which brings me to verification. There seems to be a great agreement amongst experts that verification of a nuclear-free world, to a lesser or greater degree, is achievable. All three of the panel's verification experts noted that there will always be some degree, perhaps even some non-trivial degree, of uncertainty in technical verification measures, but that those problems could be overcome by improved international cooperation on monitoring and greater political effort to provide reassurances about capabilities and intent. There was also some debate about whether discussing verification at this stage is putting the cart before the horse, or perhaps a red herring that takes the focus off the very real necessity to find the political will to take actual steps towards disarmament. On one hand, it's true that arguing about the fine points of verification at this stage probably does little good in the effort to kickstart actual disarmament. On the other hand, if nuclear weapons holders are convinced that verification is possible, that could contribute to building the confidence that's needed for those states to be more willing to consider disarmament as a viable option rather than a lofty but probably unattainable goal. It seems to me that this discussion, like many of the others over the past 2 days, has helped us sort through some of the paradoxes, of which there seem to be many, involved in finding a path to a nuclear-free world. In particular, I found the regional perspectives to be enlightening and truly believe we need to have more discussions that bring these perspectives together in a politically neutral space. So I hope the work by IDSA and India Pugwash continues. And once again, I'd like to thank the hosts, Ambassador Rakesh Sood, for organizing this very thought-provoking seminar, and I hope if you have another one, I get invited again.
Thank you. Thank you. I think one thing which came out of this session and your summing up is that there is a sense of optimism that a nuclear weapon-free world is possible, and that there should be recognition that P5 have legal commitments to nuclear disarmament, that the utility of nuclear weapons is being questioned, and that strong norms would help, and that verification is achievable. So if these things operate, then perhaps a progress towards nuclear disarmament can be made. But I think there could be different views on each of these issues, and we may get back to square one, that is of still wondering whether nuclear weapon-free world is possible. But you also raised a question whether it's even desirable, or at least some people raise that question whether it's even desirable. So thank you very much for those remarks. And now we go to session 4, which was pathways to a nuclear weapon-free world, where some practical approaches were explored, and I would request Ambassador Rakesh Sood to kindly make his remarks.
Thank you. Well, this is, since we just finished this session before lunch, I mean, it's a little tough for me to summarize, but let me try and divide it into 2 parts. You know, as you know, we had something like 7 panelists in this session, so it was, in any case, a 4-hour-long session. I think the first part was basically looking at the existing routes to a nuclear weapon-free world. Existing routes, by existing I mean routes that have been tried and worked on. So bilateral reductions, I mean, everybody mentioned the fact that all the reductions that have taken place in nuclear arsenals, the fact that they have come down, I think the figure cited was from 70,000 plus to 17,000 in the CIPRI, which includes a lot of reserve stockpiles, those awaiting dismantlement, etc., etc. So, which is a fairly significant reduction. Now, actually, had it been the other way around, and you would actually seen a growth from say 17,000 to 70,000, I think the concerns about what it implied for nuclear risks and threats would have been a very, very high concern. So if we just reverse it, as I think our Anton mentioned and some of the others mentioned, our Chinese colleagues mentioned, there should be a degree of reassurance. But then the challenge arises from the fact that nobody really seems to know whether this approach can actually take one down to zero. I mean, and whether this has come to mark its own limited success. It has achieved a lot, but is this the path that can take us forward? I think a similar kind of a thing was evident in the second theme, which was the limitations of existing treaty-based regimes. I think there was questions about nuclear weapon-free zones, sense of frustration with the impasse in the CD, the limitations, or as NPT reached the limits of its success, as it were, and is now a victim of its own success, because the imbalance that has been created has now become so much more obvious. And I think, as somebody said that, I think Ramesh mentioned in a different discussion, that the gap between behavior and norms is no longer as sustainable as it was earlier. So in that sense, there is a clear limitation that the NPT approach takes us to. But then, as was also pointed out, that can we create a new regime without necessarily dismantling the existing regime, because dismantling it could lead to unforeseen consequences. But at the same time, I mean, one can pose this question from the flip side again, and say that if the basic objectives of the two regimes are inconsistent, then is it possible to create a new regime while retaining a large body of adherents to the old regime, which is inconsistent? So I mean, you know, it's an ideological kind of a debate, and which is what brings us to the third session, where I think we saw some very interesting discussions on new stakeholders and new approaches. And it's very difficult to sum it up in a sense, because I think a completely new approach that we move towards the idea that well, forget nuclear weapon states, let non-nuclear weapon states come together and negotiate, and it creates a norm. And gradually it strengthens the norm against nuclear weapons. When it's, you know, it's a perfectly logical, if, but certainly out of the box kind of an approach, because this is not the way in which any negotiations, particularly arms control, security related negotiations, have taken place in the past. At the same time, we got a healthy dose of skepticism, saying that, look, you know, the center of gravity in a sense is shifting from Europe to Asia. The issues here are far more complex. And if you bring in the nuclear dimension into the relationships, bilateral and regional relationships in this region, in Asia, then what we are looking at is a new kind of balance of power, because what existed in Europe was also a balance of power. And the difference here is that in Europe, by the time the balance of power came into being in the 50s and so on, and NATO was 1950, if I remember right. And so 49, 50? 49. Yeah. And so in that sense, you already had the two hegemons. The east-west divide had already taken place. And then the balance of power that got created just continued as it were, as a way of managing relationships between the two principles, namely the US and the Soviet Union. And everybody realizes that this is not the case in Asia, because you have to now create a balance of power or a concert or whatever it is between a region where there is change taking place. So there is no Cold War, there is no two hegemons, there is a multipolarity in that sense, and that creates its own complex dynamic. But at the same time, it is also a fact that the existing institutional frameworks no longer seem to serve the purpose. So therefore, either we create new, and this is, I would say, it would be a question worth pondering on as a conclusion, that either we create new institutional frameworks which could be more viable, or we will move back into default mode of balance of power. Because if we are not successful in creating more viable institutional frameworks that can deal with this dynamic of shifting of change, then countries, or at least the larger countries, will certainly move back into default mode, which also then comes to Patricia's question, which she has talked of, and which I think is an interesting theme that has been thrown up, and more than one person has referred to it, namely the deterrence doctrine as a proliferation driver. And related to that, in the last session or something, when she said that the extended deterrence and the questioning of the extended deterrence. Now, do you foresee extended deterrence being questioned more in Europe or in Asia? I mean, it's an interesting point to ponder over, and therefore the future of extended deterrence, and particularly the future of extended deterrence when it comes to the US extended deterrence, because widely speaking, I mean, US is seen as no longer the sole superpower kind of an approach, or even a superpower in a bipolar world as it was earlier. So therefore, if extended deterrence is going to be questioned, and if the center of gravity is moving to Asia, then if it gets questioned in Asia, what are the implications of that? And does it lead to greater nuclear stability, or first stability within Asia, and as a consequence nuclear stability? Or does it have adverse consequences? But I think this is extremely important for the simple reason that we have the new sort of stakeholders approach is of completely doing away with this and not waiting for progress to be made on verification or technical issues, not waiting for the political climate to be right, but merely mobilizing public opinion, bypassing governments as it were, if need be, bypassing established centers of authority, say militaries or whatever it is, foreign offices, military establishments, and instead moving to a different set of players and encouraging that set of players to create the necessary momentum that can drive the process forward. And instead of legally binding agreements, because after all, I mean, what we have always looked at in the past has been the negotiation of legally binding agreements, and gradually it became legally binding agreements which were effectively verifiable and a non-discriminatory manner, internationally verifiable, effectively verifiable, and so on, each backed up by huge organizations or international organizations and so on. Now, if that is not going to be the case, because let us say if citizens groups, I think reference was made to groups of religious leaders, or religious groupings, or other NGOs, and 300 NGOs from 3,000 NGOs from 90 countries was a figure that was mentioned by Mr. Kawasaki. 300 NGOs from 90 countries. Sorry, he would have preferred if it was 3,000, I'm sure, but okay. Or Alan spoke about parliamentarians as a mobilizing force, or religious leaders as a mobilizing force. Now, obviously, they're not going to put together international effective verification mechanisms, which are geographically balanced, and all of that kind of stuff. But are these can these drive the process forward in a significant way? I mean, or can it just be a catalyst, or it can actually drive the process forward? I don't know. I don't think anybody has any answers to that. But there were certainly some very interesting questions that got thrown up in the discussion, and I think that these questions all deserve further consideration and further elaboration, and maybe some further research. Thank you.
Thank you. That's another paradox. I mean, this has been a conference of paradoxes actually. And that's another paradox, that existing legal regimes, treaties and so on are not delivering. The new order is not yet there, and then what do we do in the meanwhile? And when you have these forces of change which are originating outside the governments and the institutional frameworks, and they are becoming strong, and they are taking advantage of technology, and they are not really concerned with as you said, the existing regimes, and they are putting pressures. So will the governments yield? Will the governments be able to direct that energy? So we are in a very uncertain situation, but I think the session certainly put in perspective that the nuclear debate cannot be seen in isolation of the larger debate, which is the changing world order. So, and of course the research agenda, even each sentence that you spoke actually is a research topic. So I do not know how many we can tackle, but this university, that's why new universities are being set up these days.
Or new
and you have written that great book that came out on international security. You had written a chapter on that
That's
thick
right.
book.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful book which actually talked about this broader concept of security, and how the research agendas themselves are changing. But this is the point I think I wish to make, because nuclear weapons and the nuclear debate has been in a realist framework. And whether that realist framework, of course, realism stays, and Thucydides were mentioned in the morning, and new balance of power will emerge. But how many stakeholders are there? Today's situation is that everybody is a stakeholder. So there are probably 7 billion stakeholders, because everybody has certain. So it has basically confused the situation so much. I mean, I'm sorry to use that word once again. But no, because what this is coming to me from numerous other debates we have in the institute. We deal with energy, we deal with climate change, we deal with terrorism, we deal with, and all these seem to somewhere combine and create that uncertainty in our minds. Yeah.
IDSA is contributing to this confusion.
Well, you have to read our website and tell us whether we are. But we try to be prescriptive also sometimes. But thank you very much. I think that was useful. I know many people would like to take part in this debate, but before I get into the question answers and lose control over time, I will quickly move over to Ukraine. इकट्ठे कर लेते हैं. Just because I think Ramesh may also have some points to make about what we have talked. But very briefly, if you could kindly touch upon the situation in Ukraine and its impact on the nuclear order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't comment on the various summaries, but it seems to me that one organizing question when we come to writing the chapters for your book might well be, is the NPT regime still fit for purpose? Which brings all these elements together, but leave that aside. Ukraine and great power relations. You'll appreciate that I was asked to do this as we walked in after lunch by the chair. So I've tried to organize my thoughts under three headings. First, do we, and by that I mean we in the West, wish to make the fate of Crimea the organizing principle of US-Russia relations? It's easy enough to react and put in place various measures. I think it's very important to think things through first and then take measures in relation to the overall strategic objective. Because in this case, there is a fundamental asymmetry of interests involved. For reasons of history, for reasons of linguistic and family ties that Anton referred to earlier in the day, and for reasons of geostrategic interests. On the one side, with Russia, there are core interests involved. On the Western side, there are peripheral interests. For Russia, it's an existential issue. For the West, it's an optional add-on. By invading Iraq in 2003, United States effectively delivered that country to Iran. If the West becomes ensnared in a new period of tense and difficult relations with Russia, it seems to me the primary strategic victor of that would be China. Is that in the West's interests? So that's one question. Second, I want to come back to this question of, because it's very tempting and seductive, if only Ukraine had kept its nukes. Some comments on that. First, again, as Anton reminded us, the nuclear weapons were located in, but always under Moscow's control, including the authorization codes. Second, as a proxy summary point, the whole issue of path dependence. Would we ever have got to this stage of crisis in this year if in fact Ukraine had usable nuclear weapons under its control? Fundamentally, both Moscow and Washington would have approached and organized the relations with Ukraine in a qualitatively different manner. And I don't see how Russia would have taken any risks with letting this geostrategically deteriorate to its disadvantage. Or to put it another way, if Ukraine had been a nuclear weapon power, would the Americans and the Europeans have interfered so blatantly, including Victoria Nuland that Anton referred to try and oust President Yanukovych, the democratically elected, no matter all his other faults? So you can't suddenly detach Ukraine from its history and say, if only it had had its nuclear weapons, it might have been able to resist Russia in the Crimea, because the whole historical trajectory and the implications for the NPT as well would have been fundamentally and qualitatively different. So I think we need to bear that in mind. Third, and final set of comments. It's a pity Raja Mohan isn't here. The onward march of history, in my view, does not respect political correctness. To the contrary, history renders very harsh and unforgiving judgments on A, those who are big strategic losers, and B, those who make the big strategic mistakes. We've had Thucydides quoted. To me, the better quote from him is, the strong do as they can, the weak suffer as they must. Complement that with Kissinger's comment in relation to the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands. Argentina forgot that a great power does not retreat forever. Why do I begin with these? Because the basic question for us is Russia still a great power? As an academic, I don't believe we have the theoretical and analytical tools to assess while it is happening that a great power is now fading for the next historical phase. Great powers do rise and fall, but we can't judge it while it's happening that a great power is disappearing and fading. If Russia is not a great power and its decline and reverses are permanent, then two questions. what does that say to us about the irrelevance of nuclear weapons as a currency of power? If Russia still has approximately 47-48% of nuclear warheads in the world, but is not a great power, then we are saying nuclear weapons are totally irrelevant as a currency of power. Secondly, if Russia is not still a great power, then it is Russia that will pay the biggest price for acting as if it still were a great power. And that's where the judgment of history comes in. Alternatively, Russia is still a great power. And maybe Putin has considerable support amongst Russians because he has repositioned Russia to re-emerge as a great power, having described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical blunder of the last century. If indeed then Russia is still a great power and a recovering great power, then I don't think we can ignore the strategic implications of how great powers behave with respect to core interests and core spheres of influence, where they do have legitimate interests as great powers, in which case it is the West that will pay the basic price for the strategic error of misidentifying Russia as a permanently collapsed, or not permanently but for the foreseeable future in history's evolution. And we have certainly, I think, treated Russia as if it was finished, ignoring understandings on the basis of which the Russians peacefully withdrew troops, starting with East Germany, acquiesced to their historic defeat in the Cold War, but on conditions that NATO would not expand eastwards. Instead, NATO has been engaged in a relentless expansion eastwards. And if Russia is indeed still a great power, it was entirely predictable that at some stage Russia would push back. It so happens Ukraine is the place, and 2014 is the year in which the pushback occurs, if Russia is still a great power. Does this mean that we are into another new Cold War? I don't think so. To my mind, there were three essential defining features of the Cold War, none of which is likely in the foreseeable future. One, it was a global struggle for power between the two superpowers. Russia is a pale shadow of what it was. It is in no position to challenge global military superiority of the United States, other than in its immediate things. Can defend itself maybe, but is not going to be a military challenger to the United States all around the world. That is not possible in the foreseeable future. Second, it was an ideological clash fundamentally between political pluralism and liberal democracy and communism as an ideology. Communism as an ideology is totally discredited. Its biggest adherents seem to be in this country in terms of some political parties. But the rest of the world has moved on. I don't see that making a comeback. You might have qualifications and criticisms about democracy and how it's practiced and operates, but it's not going to be an ideological struggle again between communism and democracy. So the second element is not there. Third, it was a similar clash of economic models between market principles and command economy. The command economy also is totally discredited for the foreseeable future. That's not going to make a comeback. We might want to question the extent to which we want market to rule our lives, and we might want to put regulations and controls on that, but we are not going to go to the command model. So not one of the three is relevant, let alone all three. So I don't think we are going to go into a Cold War. But having said that, if Russia, and I'll finish with this, if Russia still is a great power, then its capacity to make mischief in various trouble spots and hotspots around the world, to make mischief as opposed to controlling the agenda, is still considerable. And its cooperation will still be vital for achieving a whole range of important goals globally and regionally around the world. And it may withdraw and withhold cooperation on those, including on the next items on the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament agenda. And I'll finish with that.
Thank you. Thank you for those perceptive comments. And I now move to Mr. Anton Klopkov.
Yeah, we'll make just a few additional comments to what I said this morning. First, I would like to remind how the crisis started. I mean, the timing was not a Russia's choice, because it was right after Winter Olympics, before Paralympics, and for most of Russian people, Olympics was such a huge success, in spite of the media coverage, especially at the beginning and before that. From organizational point of view, from sport point of view, it was a huge success for Russia, and a lot of political and financial efforts has been spent to make it possible. And nobody in Russia was interested in the government to have any crisis shortly after Olympics. I'm sure people was interested to have some rest, to have a drink or even a few, but not take care of this crisis. So the reaction was very emotional, I think. The decision was made by a very close circle. But now I think it's done. I mean, on Crimea, this is part of Russia. Some countries could not recognize that, but there is nothing to do with that. And again, I made this point this morning, but I would like to underline it again. We should pay more attention to the whole Ukraine, how to stabilize the situation, but not Crimea only. Second point, we should calibrate the response and reaction, because one of the first reaction by NATO was to cancel joint exercise to escort US vessel where Syrian chemical weapons will be destroyed. And this was just stupid, because Syrian chemical weapons destruction could be one of the non-proliferation success stories during the recent decades. And to touch this issue, this is a huge mistake. I was sure that Russian government will retaliate. The good news that I was wrong. As of now, Russia made not any step in return, and I was quite surprised recently. I was quite surprised by that, and about a week before I met people at the high level in the foreign ministry and asked about that, and I was assured that there would be no reaction of Russia on that particular step, which sounds good. But we should try to calibrate our response, because there are two very important issues, at least two very important issues. Negotiations on Iran in the non-proliferation field, negotiations on Iran, and cooperation on chemical weapon destruction in Syria. And we should do our best to prevent any impact on these two particular areas of cooperation between Russia and US. I mean, there are many others, but don't touch these two. And we should stop using the words like Cold War, because we mislead and misguide the public opinion. I absolutely agree with Ramesh Thakur that we are far from that stage. But making public statements like this, that Cold War is back, or Cold War 2.0 is coming, we bring some support among public opinion, who probably would not think in this way, with no many statements from well-known experts, high-ranking officials from a number of countries. Whether Russia is a superpower or not, probably my last comment, people in Russia are not interested to see the country active across the globe, because those of you who visited Soviet Union and who visited it recently understand what the changes are. So people just recently receive an opportunity to travel freely, to be less dependent from the government as they were 25 years ago. So people just would like to enjoy with this kind of new life, and there is no much interest among people, and I think to some extent elite as well, to be a superpower as Soviet Union was. But people support a lot what has been done recently in Crimea, because people believe, and public opinion is very strong on that Russia's interests are being ignored. I made one example earlier today. I mean, there are many, and probably the red line has been crossed, or how people saw the red line in Moscow and in Kremlin, and there is a huge support. Again, what happened, but at the same time, I did not find, hopefully I would not be wrong in a few months, but I did not find any interest to use Russian force in Ukraine. Again, I spoke with military people, with diplomats. I mean, have not found any interest. Though Russia would have to react if there would be further growth of violence. I don't know how. Hopefully not by using military and using force. But there are a lot of Russians. There are a lot of Russians in Ukraine, and many people in Russia see it as not as a part of Russia, but many people who are living in Ukraine like Russians. And I remember that shortly after Olympics, my father during the recent weeks were in Switzerland, in CERN, and he sent me email, congratulations on Olympics, but we lost Ukraine. Because, as I mentioned, we do have very close family connections with Ukraine, and it could not be ignored. So I will stop here.
Thank you. I think now we'll open the floor. I think before I come, you had indicated that you would like to make some remarks here. Mr. Lordgaard, I'll come to you.
Very briefly. International law has taken many hits recently, even in Europe. Russia has violated the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, Budapest 1994. Among its foremost critics are powers which usually, more often than not, violate international law when they resort to force. Certainly, what has happened is a strong blow to the credibility of negative security assurances. That point is obvious. But in essence, international law has come to be an argument of convenience, again, even in Europe. So I would like to make 2 points about how that situation might be remedied. And the first one is, I think we have to upgrade and reconfirm the 10 commandments of the Helsinki Final Act. And I think that effort ought to be inspired by the philosophy of common security from the Palme Commission. Security is something that we have to build together with our opponents. And another principle should be that no grouping or organization should have a monopoly on security management in their respective areas to constrain spheres of influence policies. The second is that we are lacking common organs in the European security system to handle events like those in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine today. I mean, in the case of the Ukraine, there was a full-blown crisis before important actors started to talk to each other. In the aftermath of Georgia, Medvedev and Sarkozy had some ideas about how to build a better European security system. Some European countries joined in, Germany, Italy. Many others scoffed at it, and it was soon forgotten. And today again, I feel we have to raise the same issues, because much of what has happened is a strong reminder that the European security system is deficient. Around 1990, there was a mantra in European capitals to the effect that Russia has to be integrated into European security and cooperation, and it has still not happened.
Thank you. I have several hands, and I've taken note of them in the order that I saw them. I'll start with Mr. Potter.
Thank you very much. A couple of observations with respect to Ukraine, and I should kind of truth in advertising note that I have relatives from both Ukraine and Russia, and one family went back and forth between Ukraine, Russia, and Poland over the years, so I speak sympathetically to Anton's point about the connectivity between the populace in both countries. But I find very objectionable the argument about coming to the defense of Russians wherever they may be, starting with my own family. If one wants to count populations, one could start looking at Israel. We can look in California, we can look in New York. There are tremendous numbers of a Russian diaspora. And I think it's a pretext which does not bear up upon close scrutiny. So I don't find compelling at all the notion that where there are Russians, there is a rationale for Russian intervention. I agree with Ramesh that it is inappropriate to speak about a return of a Cold War. But I think we also need to be very, very careful not to underestimate the impact of the crisis that we are observing, both in terms of U.S.-Russian relations, relations between the West and Russia more generally, and the potential for a very negative impact of these developments on the international nuclear order, and specifically on the non-proliferation regime. And in this context, I think, as I know many of you know, but I'm not sure it's been mentioned at this particular conference, there is a very long and dynamic history of U.S.-Soviet cooperation during even the most frigid moments of the Cold War, in part thanks to India. It was really after the Indian test in 1994 that the United States and the 1974, excuse me, that the United States and the Soviet Union began rather intensively to collaborate on a variety of issues with respect to nuclear export policy and non-proliferation more generally. But I don't think we should assume that simply because that persisted during the Cold War, even after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that cooperation will necessarily persist. And I think one reason for that, although objectively it should, because of the domestic politics of the issue in the United States and elsewhere, we see a real empowerment of extreme elements in many countries, which will make it much more difficult for at least the American president to do what he might want to do. And so I caution about that. If we had more time, I would spell out a variety of ways in which I think this is going to play out very negatively at the NPT PrepCom, assuming that the situation remains relatively static. We don't really know what's going to happen between April 3rd and April 28th, but I think there's going to be the potential for not only the disruption of P5 solidarity, But whether you're talking about issues having to do with negative security assurances, nuclear weapons-free zones, the role of nuclear weapons in one's security policies, the extended nuclear deterrence and nuclear umbrella, non-strategic nuclear weapons, a host of these issues that will be obviously the subject of debate at the NPT. I think there's a potential for a very poisoned atmosphere, and in particular, and this is what I worry about most, that there are going to be statements made by some parties of an emotional nature which could escalate. And while I don't want to exaggerate the situation, I would say it's not out of the question that some countries or a country might walk out of the PrEPCOM. It's not going to be Egypt this time. And so I wanted to make that point. The only other point I think there needs to be a better informed discussion of the potential that Ukraine had at the time that it obtained nuclear weapons on its territory because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine clearly was not a nuclear weapons power. They did not have the capability, an operational capability, at the moment that they assumed or inherited the nuclear weapons. But it's also not correct to suggest that capability was that far removed. And I mean, even if you talk about the whole question of having access to the security codes, one of the two major firms that was involved in the business of developing these codes was based in Kharkiv. And interestingly, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that firm and its partner firm in then Leningrad continued to collaborate. And so they didn't have a test site, but they had delivery systems, they had a very large nuclear infrastructure, and I think they had the technical capability within a reasonable, whatever that means, period of time to have acquired command and control had the Russians permitted it. That is another big if, had Russia permitted it. So I just caution about both extremes, assuming that they didn't have a capability and wouldn't have a capability, and the need to think about what might have transpired. I don't think we really can say with much confidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This statement is not going to be terribly diplomatic, but since I'm not a diplomat, that probably doesn't matter a great deal. I want to be very blunt. The Ukraine situation is a catastrophe for arms control and disarmament. It's been described as a complex situation, implying that there's some measure of perhaps acceptability in what Russia did. And there's not. This is a very simply wrong and illegal situation in which one country has annexed a large chunk of territory belonging to another country. This is not like the Senkaku Islands, where you have two countries with long historical claims. This is a border that Russia had recognized under, it was an indisputed border under international law. You can think the opposition is corrupt, or now the government of Ukraine is corrupt, as I do. You can think the EU behaved badly and engaged in underhand dealing, as I do. You can think that there should have been a Scotland-style referendum in Crimea, as I do. You can think that Crimea is a core interest for the Ukraine and a peripheral interest for the US and NATO, as I do. And none of that makes any difference to the legality of annexing a large chunk of someone else's territory. Speaking of double standards, many people, quite rightly, were very happy to criticize the US for invading Iraq in 2003. It's double standards not to call out Russia for doing exactly the same thing when Russia invades another country illegally. So why do I say this is a catastrophe for disarmament efforts? Okay, it's not because of the argument that had the Ukraine had nuclear weapons, it could have deterred the invasion, and we can argue over that one. The first effect that it's already happening is on NATO policy in Europe. There are other countries in Europe with large Russian populations. I'm thinking particularly of Estonia and Lithuania. Those countries have been saying for quite a long time in Europe, in NATO, that they're worried about a Russian invasion, the argument that that's actually not something you have to worry about has now become all of a sudden a lot harder to make. As a result, tactical nuclear weapons are going to stay in Europe. I mean, they probably were anyway, but it's now made the case just, I think, impossible to change. Already NATO is now deploying more ballistic missile defenses. NATO is now talking about moving forces further eastwards. You know, one can agree or disagree over whether this is a good reaction or a bad reaction. That's not my point. It's from the point of view of what we're discussing today. All of that makes any kind of arms control with Russia much, much harder. And secondly, you know, there's the US domestic politics aspect to all of this. You know, the idea that any kind of arms control negotiation now can even get started between the US and Russia, I think has become, you know, unimaginable. You know, I'd also point out the subject of the intermediate range nuclear forces hasn't been raised at all yet during this conference. Now, there's been accusations Russia has violated the treaty. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. The evidence hasn't been presented publicly yet. But again, the fact that Russia refuses to even discuss this issue, that it doesn't even recognize this as a legitimate issue for discussion with the United States, I think is symptomatic of the problems that we're facing at the moment. So as much as I strongly support the goal of a world without nuclear weapons and good faith efforts to get there, I think we have to be absolutely clear-sighted about what's going on in Europe at the moment and what effect it's going to have on that process, because it is profoundly and uniformly negative.
You know, I am a little befuddled at the end of this 2 days, because we have this contradiction. On the one hand, we heard very persuasive argument that the order is not there. You don't see any order. There is only a concert of powers, and maybe these powers will work. On the other hand, in the question of Ukraine, there is this very profound argument and very persuasive that what has happened in Crimea is actually illegal, because as though there was a certain order which has been violated violently. So you find these two trends which are there emerging. Now, I speak for India. I mean, coming from you know, where you are, you have an interest. India, I don't see how they can, in the coming years or decades, can live in a world which is chaotic, because India is not a superpower. So we have an interest in a law, in a well-ordered world. So what can be done to get that order? Now, if you were to argue like the big powers do, that, well, there is a concert, you and I come together and we run the world. There could be G2, there could be European, China, and America, they can run the world. But all this business of running the world is in the hands of those who have been doing it badly or nicely. But those who are not part of that setup, for them to think that the world will be like that, it escapes my comprehension. You know, India, in our ethos, I'm very fond of quoting that, there is a thing called dharmo rakshati rakshita. Dharma is norm. It's not just religion, but a norm, a principles. So if you defend a principle, if you defend a norm, it defends you. Now, the moment you begin to abandon a principle in the slightest view of a crisis and pontificate, the crisis, you know, this is how the world will be, I find it's very frightening. So nuclear disarmament and nuclear elimination is one aspect. But if you were to think about a world which will be less orderly than what it was since the 1945, or even since 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, if you're giving in to an order which could be more chaotic, one should really think whether it is really based on facts or a kind of fear or a scare or a certain, you know, perverse vanity of the defeated, because the defeated say, oh, it's all gone, you know, and thereby he feels very, very good. I think there is an emotional point we must understand, and I feel in my talk also I mentioned that this nuclear disarmament business, yes, it has gone on for 50 years. But you know, just 1 minute, you know, if you have seen the film Lincoln, there is an episode there where the president has managed to convince the leader of the opposition in the Senate, and then he is arguing for removing of Lincoln's ideas. And at that time, in 1863, he says, "I'm not asking for women's rights." And they say, no. Now, this is very, very revealing that such a revolutionary step forward, when it was taken in 1863, 1864, they were not able to deal with the other thing which from circa 2014 would be totally obnoxious. So history moves in steps, but in search for an order, if you allow the best to be the enemy of the good, then you're in for a much worse time. Thank you.
Now, Vidya-Shankar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to remind you, you and I were part of a group that the Prime Minister had, and we submitted a report, so I was just going to quote from it briefly to say that the alternative already exists. We say on page 178 of our report, Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan report submitted to the PM in 2011, the argument for nuclear weapons is predicated on the practical. The argument against nuclear weapons is predicated on the moral. This is usually what happens. The world of today, with the international experience of terrorism, has exposed the flaw in this reasoning. The argument for nuclear weapons is predicated on the immoral, and the argument against nuclear weapons is predicated on the practical. So you can change the discourse by using the language appropriately. The problem is we are stuck in that language. Let me flip the question and ask you, why not abandon the pursuit of a world free of nuclear weapons? Why are we pursuing it? Why are you looking for whether there is consensus on that idea or not? Flip the question and you'll get the answer. The answer is simple. You don't accept the accidental or use by design of any nuclear weapon. Balance of power. Now, realist theoretical construct to understand the world. That's what it is. Now, it in itself has created mental blocks that obfuscate more than they clarify by jargonizing issues. Let's not forget, in realist theory, there can never be a nuclear weapons free world. So if you're going to continue to use that language, you're stuck there. There is only one reason to pursue the goal, and that is that any use of these weapons by accident or design is unacceptable because of its inhuman consequences. Therefore, Raja Mohan, I think, is self-contradictory. If existing security structures, as he said, are not working, as Mr. Sharma also pointed out now, it's not because a new balance of power is needed. It's because security is being seen in a framework divorced from real life, and it's being called balance of power. It's actually mutual terrorism. That's what it is, mutual blackmail. So, the question of Ukraine, would nuclear weapons have in any way prevented this from happening to the Ukraine and so on? I think again the wrong questions is being asked. Now, if Ukraine had retained its nuclear weapons, this is what I would say. Using them would still cause unacceptable damage to humanity. The lesson from Ukraine to me is not whether deterrence would have worked or not worked, but on how the 1994 Budapest Memorandum assuring Ukraine security was not worth the paper it was signed on. Now, this is by no means an isolated example in international relations. You see this repeated hypocrisy all the time. Any argument that simply says this is illegal by international law wouldn't hold water, because you know in the case of nuclear weapons in particular what the International Court of Justice said. And you know what specifically the international humanitarian law says on this. And India's stand, as Alan Webb pointed out today, at the ICJ on a second strike is that we consider it illegal. And yet we are talking about massive retaliation in our nuclear doctrine. This is the hypocrisy of the stand that exists. So here's my specific suggestion to this group after the 2 days of our conference. First is India specific. We have supported the NAM resolution at the UN First Committee. We have also supported the open-ended working group resolution at the UN First Committee. This is a change in our stand. We used to abstain earlier. For the first time, we voted in favor. Well, the NAM resolution actually calls for working towards starting the work on a convention by 2018. Let's get working on it. Let's try and make that happen. Let's not just talk. Second, we've supported in the NAM resolution, there is a call on states for domestic propagation of the idea of a nuclear weapons free world. Why isn't the government of India going head on this? It should be going all out and publicizing its stand on a nuclear weapons free world and not keeping quiet on this. We don't hear anything from the government of India on this subject on the domestic front for various reasons. So,
the specific suggestion would be, apart from the resolutions on the UN First Committee, here's the other thing we should do. We must back the humanitarian initiative full hilt. I see it will destroy the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is the biggest block for nuclear disarmament. You will never have the world rid of nuclear weapons so long as the Non-Proliferation Treaty says it's okay for some people to have nuclear weapons and not okay for others. It's time to replace the NPT, and that's the big elephant in the room people are not pointing fingers to. And I would say that's the bridge that Ambassador Rakesh Sood suggests. Can a new regime come into play without dismantling the old? He's basically saying what India is doing. India says we follow the non-proliferation regime, but we are not members of the NPT. Hey, what's that non-proliferation regime that India follows? Can that succeed the NPT? Can that be a way forward? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I have several hands. Yeah. But let me just break the monotony a bit and come back to the panelists. Because there have been some I will come to you, ma'am. There have been several very interesting interventions, and I think they require some kind of a response, though I hope it's going to be very brief, because I'd like to get back to the floor as soon as I can. So maybe I can start this time from this side. Yeah.
I do want to say that I agree with James on the question of international law. I think, again, I mentioned it in my discussion, we have a problem. If we want a nuclear-free world, plus moins, it doesn't matter. If we want a stable world, we have to have international law, and we have to follow international law. When we lay down laws, we have to support those laws. And we have a problem when major powers feel that it's okay for them to flout international law, whether it's over nuclear weapons or whether it's over invasion of territory or whether it's over economic resources or what. And so that, for me, I think is a very fundamental thing that we cannot lose sight of, no matter what. On the other hand, I hope that, James, that you're wrong with regards to the effect on the nuclear discussions, nuclear strategic relations between Moscow and Washington. I hope that Bill's limited optimism is more in effect, in that I think it's really important that countries recognize what is in their mutual interests, even when they have interests that are not the same in other places. And that's one way to remember that the world is globalized, and what we have in common is sometimes forgotten in the rush to point out what we don't have in common, where we diverge. So I would ask for some caution.
Thank you. Mr. Lodgaard.
A quick response to James, first of all. Just to recall that 1 year after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the strategic arms limitation talks started. Russia was suspended from the Council of Europe 2001 because of the war in Chechnya. And that war was nasty. It was suspended, however, only for a number of months, not for years. And less than 1 year after the war in Georgia, the United States and Russia pushed the reset button. So there is also the risk that we're whipping this crisis out of proportion, and that the effects will not be all that big. Although I would say, in reference to nuclear arms, that there are two obvious negative aspects to it. First, again, I'm convinced that the credibility of negative security assurances will suffer for long. That's a big downside. And secondly, judged by the ease with which people have jumped on the proposition that those who possess nuclear weapons are not invaded, but those who have them are not, judged by the ease with which that proposition has taken hold. I'm prepared to expect that Ukraine will be added to the list of cases that shows the correctness of that proposition.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly on the impact of Ukraine, this is really towards James and Bill. I actually agree with you. I think, unfortunately, the 2015 NPT is going to end in a failure. But it'll end in a failure not because of Ukraine. There are more than enough reasons for that not to happen, for it to succeed. The Middle East conference is just one example, and even without the walkout of Egypt, etc. But I agree with you. I think Ukraine will become a very convenient sort of excuse and argument, which both sides will perhaps use to walk away from there. But I also don't think that you'll actually see a breakdown in the P5 unity, because in some ways the stakes in the NPT for the P5 are much higher than for many of the others. And I think there will be a sort of coalescing in very informal way coming together in some way, shape or form. But I wanted to actually raise one issue that we've been kind of tiptoeing around in the conference. There have been sort of some references made to that. Ambassador Sharma talked about Lincoln, and that really triggered that as well. Raja Mohan made some references to that. And certainly I think it's important to underline that in the presence of a special envoy. And that really is the role of leadership. In some ways, it's almost impractical to assume that the 7 billion population are going to decide for the whole world. It's not going to happen. They're going to look to the leaders, and they're going to look for, people to provide that sort of degree of direction. And sadly, that has been failing. Now, we have seen, when it's worked, it's actually been able to break through the logjam. I think of the experience of this country. One person that Rakesh Sood worked with, and one person I'm working for now, Strobe Talbot and Jaswant Singh, opened up a dialogue and debate which was unprecedented, and it's led to all kinds of openings subsequently. Now, one could argue that that was the incentive or perhaps the driver behind President Obama's Prague speech, but it was half-hearted. Today the Prague agenda is nowhere. And that's unfortunate because I think that was, it was an initial start which is then not seen through. And I think this has been part of the problem, because in many ways I think the Prague agenda was quite radical, but it then required certain follow-ups which either he was not in a position to take or the circumstances changed, and that has had a very, very direct impact. In fact, it's regressed the whole sort of process going forward a little bit. So I would sort of underline this role of, the kind of role of leadership and the way to think about how we might want to address these issues going forward. And perhaps maybe, having special envoys, talking about these processes outside of the sort of more formal structures may be one way to explore. Thank you.
No, I think the Ukraine discussion, in a sense, is encapsulated some of the challenges of the broader theme of nuclear weapons that we've been talking about and discussing over the last 2 days. And I must say, it was, in that sense, it's like as if there's a spotlight that has suddenly thrown open the cracks, as it were, or exposed the cracks. But I think, as Vidya mentioned, he said, well, if a nuclear weapon-free world is so abstract and so remote and so this and so that, then why are we talking about it? Why are we pushing it? And but yet, I think we do know that we have been talking about abolition of nuclear weapons virtually from the time that nuclear weapons got invented. So something in the human mind, or something in the mind of political leaders, let me put it like this. If we go by Sidhu's idea that, leaders shape the agenda and destiny, then something in the mind of political leaders was obviously triggered at that point as well, even as nuclear weapons came into being and were used in 1945. And obviously it is something that successive generations of political leaders have talked about, whether in India or abroad. We've referred to initiatives taken by Indian leaders, and we've referred to President Obama's speech, we referred to Gorbachev, Reagan, etc., etc. So, it's different political leaders in different parts of the world have not been able to get this challenge, shall I say, of reconciling the fact that, you know, these weapons are weapons of mass destruction. We should move towards abolition of nuclear weapons, yet at the same time there are challenges involved. The peaceful application of nuclear technology cannot be thrown out, they can't be disinvented. So how do you deal with the challenge of achieving this impossible? So that's a perennial, and I think it is, and I think that is why we are spending time over it. And in that sense, there's a role of political leadership, certainly, and then there's a question of timing. You know, would, let's say, President Obama take an initiative on something like this when he is completing his second term in another, what, 2 years? Is it 2 years?
Yeah,
So, I don't know, I mean, given his domestic political situation, difficulties with Congress, Senate, etc., is it worth taking such an initiative at this stage when globally relations between major powers don't seem to be in the most stable or in the most happy of situations? So clearly not. But I guess that's what makes working on these issues so much more challenging, and hopefully we need to keep working on it as in whichever capacity we have, so that when the timing is right and the political leadership is there, we can make it move forward.
A couple of quick comments. Firstly, I think we all suffer from the tyranny of presentism. We exaggerate the importance of the present moment in terms of the long shadows it will cast in shaping future evolving destiny. So as Sverre reminded us, things can look very grim at the moment. I hope you are wrong, James. I fear you may be right. We shall have to wait and see. Second, domestic politics. I think that's a fair comment, so long as we acknowledge that applies to all countries. Whichever government comes into power here in the second half of May will have significant political imperatives and compulsions. Same applies to Russia, same applies to the United States. Domestic politics can set limits to what is possible for the leadership, no matter how creative and innovative. It may impel leaders towards certain courses of action. It is something that needs to be factored in by the various actors involved. Illegality is the most interesting argument. I think I agree with most of what you said, James, but I think we might disagree on some nuances. If you wish to understand the reaction of parts of the rest of the world to how the West is reacting, I think you have to take both Iraq in 2003 and Kosovo in 1999 together on this issue. Because, well, I'll leave Libya out. I think it clouds rather than clarifies in this one. Because one of the most fundamental norms that most countries of the world have adhered to very strongly is the inviolability of territorial borders and change by force. And you see that reflected in the General Assembly vote, which is very interesting. But the General Assembly vote, I think, is the one that is consistent through these three, from 99 Kosovo to 2003 Iraq to Ukraine today. The reason I brought Kosovo up is Iraq is relevant because at least there is more strategic justification for Russia vis-a-vis Crimea than there ever was for the United States vis-a-vis Iraq. Equally illegal if you like, but the strategic justification is there and is more understandable. But Kosovo, in the sense of we believe in self-determination as a foundation principle, we believe in state sovereignty as the foundation principle. Who gets to determine the unit of self-determination? At which point do we say, well, we have to accept reality, this group is not prepared to continue anymore, it is going to set apart. And if that group does, who determines within that if there are pockets of enclaves with different populations? So does Kosovo have the right to secede from Serbia? Does Serbia have the right to resist that by the use of force? And do outside countries have any role in deciding that? There it was answered in a different way. That hypocrisy becomes relevant as far as many other groups are concerned as well. So simply illegality, I think, becomes a catchphrase. Plus the fact, of course, that domestic legal order was circumvented in ousting the president as well. Again, you can argue about the margins of that. I don't think the question is quite as clear-cut in either direction on that one either.
Thank you.
A few points. First, I could not agree with the argument about invasion. Again, I could not just accept this word because most likely the number of Russia's forces in Crimea has been increased. But there was a bilateral agreement, and the sailing was, if I remember correct, 25,000 troops. And regular Russia has much less than that. So my reading of the situation, I don't have any evidence of that there is no data available, but my understanding that most likely Russia increased number of troops in Crimea, but it was still below the sailing. So I mean, there was no any troops in other parts of Ukraine. Second, I'm not the person who should be persuaded how this situation looks like from international law point of view. Again, it's quite clear for me, and I share what Sver said at the beginning of his comment. The problem I have with James, your comment that this option, quite a radical option, how to deal with Crimea, most likely were developed after Iraq, after Yugoslavian, Kosovo, and Libya. Again, most likely we would never be able to verify that, probably 30 years or 40 years later in some memoirs, but I'm almost sure that this option, which was offered to the president, was developed quite recently, based on previous experience. And the same true with regard what could be the impact of situation with Crimea on arms control or arms control and disarmament. We should not forget that there was a previous stage which affected a lot Russia's policy in this particular field. When Russia reviewed its policy in disarmament and arms control, it could be visible, it could be not much visible, but Iraq, Yugoslavia, Kosovo, and Libya affected Russia's arms control policy a lot. So I agree with you that in the field of arms control, what happened would have effect. But again, we could not discuss this issue with no taking into consideration what motivated Russia to make such a difficult decision and what were other reasons which impact on Russia's arms control and disarmament policy during the last probably 10 years. Better economic strength is not the key issue here. And probably, the final point again, we should be pragmatic, what is available, what is not available, and I would make another point that it's well known that almost a day before Yugoslavian bomb campaign started, Prime Minister Evgeny Primakov was on his way to US, and he was informed by Olgar that the bomb attack is inevitable, so he made his well-known U-turn over Atlantic and returned back. But in spite of that, one important agreement was signed exactly the same day. It was part of so-called HEU deal, because in 1996 and until 1999, HEU deal faced huge problems with so-called natural component. And for 3 years, Russia and US with some European countries were trying to solve that. And the ceremony of signing a few related contracts were going to take place when Primakov would arrive. So he canceled his visit, but people in DOE, Ministry of Atomic Energy, State Department, and Russian Foreign Ministry were pragmatic enough. And so they decided to speed up the signing ceremony. So it was done a day before when it was expected, before the campaign officially started. And it solved the problem. And one of the person who contributed a lot to, and it was a real success story, one of the person who contributed a lot to make it possible, it's Rose Gattemüller. She was actively involved that time. So again, I agree with you that especially disarmament, I would say most of areas where military are involved would be affected. But we should try to be pragmatic. In those areas where we have common interest, we should try not to touch them. As I mentioned, Syrian chemical weapon construction is one of the examples.